Hi, this is Andy Hoffman, Marketing Director of Miles Franklin Precious Metals in our 26th year in business. It's Sunday, February 8th, 2015, and the title of today's audio blog is Precious Metal Mining and Other Near-Term Armageddons. Following Friday's prototypical orchestrated paper precious metal raid, amidst one of the most egregiously fabricated NFP employment reports in history, which, by the way, I discussed in yesterday's Employment American Style, an astute loyal reader wrote, "We may never live to see gold and silver valued by market forces. The elites behind the New World Order and market manipulation are the law." I couldn't disagree more, starting with the term New World Order, which in my mind is nothing but a fear-mongering buzzword for newsletter writers and radio show hosts seeking paid subscriptions by playing on human nature's most primitive emotion, i.e., fear of the unknown. Logic tells us that in a world of 7+ billion people speaking hundreds of languages and thousands of cultures, that there is no secret group of elites pulling the strings, let alone one that could not only communicate with each other in an even plane, but have the same interests. Much less one with the ability to move economies, markets, and perceptions at will. No, Occam's razor tells us otherwise, and unless one wants to believe such a group is divine, in other words, God himself manipulates markets, it would be much wiser to make investment decisions based on the facts. And by the way, when I use the term the powers that be in articles and podcasts, I am decidedly not referring to the Bilderbergs, Rothschilds, or any other fabricated boogeyman of the financial world, but to the contrary, those in power in each individual nation, from the United States to Zimbabwe. Unquestionably, each such power center is dominated by politicians and bankers, as has been the case throughout history. And unquestionably, said politicians and bankers do in fact collude on certain issues, such as, for instance, the Fed agreeing to provide covert secret loans or overt swap agreements to distressed European banks. However, there is absolutely zero chance that these groups are working together toward anything, and even less chance of success if they actually had attempted to do so. To wit, in last week's The Last to Go article, I wrote of how said powers that be have essentially lost control of everything except large cap stock indices like the Dow Jones Propaganda Average and the paper prices of US dollar price gold and silver. For years, I've written that even the least unsavvy financial beings have it ingrained in their DNA that a rising Dow is good and rising gold bad. This is why it is so important to manipulate these markets, which is clearly easy to do for the Dow, given that it can be floated infinitely higher by simply printing money and buying it. However, in the case of gold and silver, there is a decidedly finite amount of physical supply, both in and above the ground, and objectively the cost of production is far higher than today's suppressed levels. This is why physical demand is at record levels and physical supply on the verge of an historic plunge that will likely never be reversed, which I'll get to in a minute. That said, only a handful of said 7+ billion people can make the claim that manipulators have actually succeeded in suppressing gold prices. As outside America, where currencies are plunging as the entire world prepares for the big one to hit, gold prices are invariably at or near all-time high levels. And thus, whilst said reader feels frustrated and angry at the US government's heinous price-suppressing actions, as I do, readers in nations as diverse as Japan, Russia, Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, and South Africa, to name a few, and heck, even Canada and Australia, where the Miles Franklin blog has its highest non-US readership, see gold in their local currencies at or near all-time highs. Even Europrice gold recently surged to within 16% of its all-time high, which nearly assuredly it will reach in the foreseeable future, especially if said powers that be can't get Greece to kowtow to its demand as soon as this Wednesday's emergency Eurogroup meeting, which, by the way, I don't think they'll be able to do, given Syriza's mandate to end austerity and write off Greece's debt. And right behind them, Spain's Podemos party intends to do the same, as does Italy's Five Star Movement, France's National Front Party, and countless others in Portugal, Ireland, and other hopelessly indebted nations. In fact, Greece's new militant finance minister Yanis Varoufakis today boldly claimed what we can do for the rest of Europe, and Italy in particular, is open a small door to the truth. Italy stands in solidarity with Greece, but cannot tell the truth as they fear possible consequences from Germany. But trust me, they will decidedly take Greece's lead and tell the truth when the people revolt as they have in Athens. and not just in Europe, but worldwide, as history's largest fiat Ponzi scheme approaches its inevitable, horrific end. This was what I spoke of in last year's Revenge of the People audioblog, and was one of my top predictions for 2015. And by the way, part of said truth is that, as I predicted 3 years ago, the euro currency is not viable, which is exactly what the world's newest newly minted super bear, Alan Greenspan, said today when espousing, quote, Greece will leave the eurozone, and, quote, there is no way I can conceive of the euro continuing. Back to Friday's fabricated NFP employment report and accompanying precious metal paper raids, supposedly which were based on its result. I mean, I've watched this silly game for 13 years now, and the worse the politically charged labor situation gets, the more the U.S. government fudges the numbers and attacks paper, gold, and silver. This will not change until they are overwhelmed by the reality of said physical shortages, let alone the coming universal understanding that such data is fraudulent. To that end, financial media networks like CNBC are experiencing all-time low viewership and readership, as fewer and fewer people believe the propaganda. Not to mention essentially all-time low approval ratings for both Congress and the White House, all-time low investor participation in the stock market, and an historically high global mistrust of political and financial leadership. Which again proves my point that not only is there a group of omnipotent financial leaders, but that those in positions of power in this realm are decidedly failing in their attempts to maintain control. Commodities, currencies, economic activity, popular support, and even hope are dying, and given the unstoppable tsunami of reality I've long written of, the immutable laws of economic Mother Nature cannot be usurped. In other words, we are objectively in the final stages of economic collapse, which anyone with even a modicum of knowledge of fiat currency dynamics realizes to be an unavoidable truism. To wit, here is just a smattering of this weekend's news, mere hours after the supposedly positive NFP report, starting with a fact discussed by none other than Richard Russell in his Friday blog, which even I was startled to hear, which is that global debt, i.e. the portion held within view, quote, on balance sheet, has surged from 142 trillion in 2007 to 200 trillion today, i.e. an astounding 41%. And this during easily the worst global economic environment of our lifetime, and frankly the worst such situation since the Great Depression, during which, I might add, global debt was nearly non-existent, thanks to a nearly universal gold standard. Even the U.S. government's implicit partners at Bank of America predict the global economy will contract by $2.3 trillion in 2015. And if this occurs, which in my view would be a best-case scenario, will catalyze a currency war-driven money-printing explosion that will make today's insane levels appear modest. Let alone if one of dozens of potential black swan candidates emerge to accelerate the decline. For example, this weekend's massive breakdown in Russian-Ukrainian peace talks, concluding another bloody week of warfare with a defiant, aggressive Vladimir Putin, and these shockingly high-splintering comments from Francois Hollande, the president of France. Quote, we are part of a common civilization with Russia, and the interests of the Americans with the Russians are not the interests of Europe and the Russians. Or this weekend's news that Obama aims to redeploy boots on the ground in Iraq, creating a new hot war on terror against the ISIS boogeyman. This weekend, I read of the, quote, global conflict intensity index hitting a 7-year high, and based on what I anticipate politically and economically, I shudder to think where it will be at year end, let alone when the exploding currency wars truly go nuclear. I mean, think about it. The world has witnessed an astounding 542 central bank rate cuts since the 2008 crisis. Yet only now is the race to debase starting to really heat up. Or how about this weekend's news that following a modest dead count bounce in oil prices, likely U.S. government abetted by the way, from $44 a barrel to $52 a barrel, that Saudi Arabia dramatically reduced its export prices for crude oil in its most desperate market share protecting act yet. Such a blatantly aggressive action can only be interpreted as all-out desperation on the part of a nation that, at all costs, must maximize revenues to fund its $100 per barrel predicated socialism. In other words, attempting to make up for the price plunge with dramatic volume increases, which will only glut the world further, pressuring prices further downward and destroying essentially all high-cost producers, starting, of course, with a U.S. shale industry financed by $500 billion of junk debt and leveraged loans. Don't forget, even the BLS admits energy to be the only sector to have produced positive job growth since 2007, in an industry that generates one-third of all corporate capital expenditures. But don't worry, the January NFP report claimed essentially zero energy-related jobs losses, despite the fact that energy companies themselves announced tens of thousands of layoffs. Or for that matter, that shale states, amidst yet another weekly rig count plunge, have seen their biggest tax receipt implosion in a decade. And no, I'm not even close to the end of this weekend's horrible headlines, with the next such coming directly from the mouth of Thomas Jordan of the Swiss National Bank, whom I last month deemed Lady Macbeth because he doth protest too much to gold's value, in pulling every unethical, immoral, and illegal string possible to prevent passage of the Save Our Swiss Gold referendum. Such as, for example, claiming that if God forbid it passed, the Swiss bank would not be able to maintain its peg at 1.2 euros per franc. Of course, I don't need to remind anyone that just 3 weeks later, after the referendum was defeated, the SNB was forced to reduce interest rates to negative territory to support the franc, and 6 weeks later the peg was vaporized by uncontrollable market forces, just days after the Swiss National Bank assured that it wouldn't be. Anyhow, fast forwarding another mere 3 weeks to this weekend, and the whole financial world knows the S&P has indeed instituted a new suicidal Euro-franc peg, even if not by official decree. Clearly, they are now defending 1.05 euros per franc by adding still more collapsing euros to their horrifying balance sheet, which frankly could itself be vaporized within weeks, or days, as the Greek crisis intensifies. After all, just Friday afternoon, the Eurogroup gave Greece just 10 days to apply for renewal of its $275 billion bailout loans or leave the Eurozone entirely, prompting an all but militant Yanis Varoufakis, Greece's finance minister, to describe Europe's leadership as clueless political personnel in denial of the systemic nature of the crisis, pursuing policies akin to carpet bombing the economy of proud European nations in order to save them. In other words, the odds of a euro-favorable agreement are nearly zero, which is why Greek bonds and stocks plunged Friday, S&P downgraded Greece's sovereign rating to junk, mere months after upgrading it, by the way, and the increasing likelihood of bank runs and likely capital controls became mainstream news, accelerated like kerosene on a fire when Greece admitted it would run out of cash within weeks. In fact, Alexis Tsipras gave his first parliamentary speech as Greece's president today, that is Sunday, in which he loudly reiterated Syriza's stance that it will accept no more bailout money and plans to renegotiate Greece's debt. Which brings me back to Lady Macbeth Jordan, in his maniacal effort to become the most reviled central banker of all time and most vilified figure in Swiss history, who this weekend hinted at the equivalent of capital controls in Switzerland itself in claiming, quote, the Swiss National Bank is prepared to intervene in foreign exchange markets further and has room to lower already negative interest rates if necessary to weaken the franc. Not to mention, also this weekend, his words were validated by the CEO of Switzerland's fourth largest bank, who said that, quote, lowering the Swiss National Bank's already negative interest rate further or implementing capital controls would be dramatic, but is certainly possible. This, my friends, is what I mean by the final currency war I wrote of 2 years ago, going nuclear, and what I meant when I wrote Capital Controls Here We Come 18 months ago. And no, I'm just getting warmed up when it comes to the volume and breadth of massively precious metal positive, everything else negative news items of this weekend alone. Starting with the head of Degong, i.e. the Chinese equivalent of Standard & Poor's, predicting the world is heading to a financial crisis worse than 2008. And this, as this weekend, China reported concrete evidence that its historic, unprecedented real estate construction and financing bubble's implosion is accelerating, as Chinese January imports collapsed a whopping 20% from a year ago, representing its largest such plunge since the heart of the 2008-2009 crisis. And better yet, January exports plunged more than 3% versus the expectation of a 6% increase, depicting not only an economy in free fall, hence last week's massive reserve requirement reduction, but yielding the largest trade surplus in Chinese history, which undoubtedly will kick the global currency wars into seventh gear. Not to mention PBOC discussions about devaluing the yuan, which when it occurs will undoubtedly be the most impactful and horrifying financial event of our lifetimes. To that end, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of my January 2nd article, the direst prediction of all, predicting years, if not decades, of industrial and commodity overcapacity due to the massive malinvestment caused by decades of unfettered money printing and cancerous financial engineering. David Stockman deserves kudos for his unparalleled work in this area, and this week he highlights several must-read articles on the topic, coincident with the Baltic Dry Index on Friday plunging to its all-time low, last achieved 29 years ago. Ominously titled 1. Global Deflation Alert, Iron Ore Heading Toward $40 a Ton Due to Slumping Demand Surging Supply, and Race to the Bottom is On, China headed toward Big Yuan Devaluation. Even more ominously, not one, but both articles were published by Bloomberg, by far one of the most line-toting MSM lackeys. And before I get to the principal topic of today's audio blog, as if the aforementioned list of potential Armageddons is enough, let's round out this weekend's horrible headlines with the increasing likelihood of a full-fledged strike of U.S. West Coast port workers, which if it occurs could yield a catastrophic near-term plunge in U.S. trade activity. Let alone the newest member of the Bank of Japan's policy board literally claiming that in order to fix Japan, and I'm not making this up, we, quote, just need to print money. And last but not least, providing the perfect segue to today's precious metal mining Armageddon discussion, Arizona's Congress approving a measure, subject to governor veto of course, to make gold and silver legal tender, as it already is in Utah. Not that such a law would change the world significantly. However, what it would do is eliminate Arizona's state capital gains on gold and silver investments, meaning gold and silver coin investments, adding yet another reason to shun, quote, paper PM investments like mining stocks in lieu of the real thing. Which brings me to today's extremely valuable topic of the precious metal mining Armageddon I have forecast for years, which in the next 2 weeks will likely become crystal clear to the entire investment world. Not that those of us in the mining industry aren't already well aware that the production outlook has been dying for years, like me, for instance, who not only owned countless mining stocks from 2002 to 2011, but provided investor relations service for dozens of junior miners from 2006 to 2011. However, the fact remains that the majority of the world's investors are either unaware of the gold and silver mining sector's dire irreversible issues or are too brainwashed by anti-precious metal propaganda to even consider them. But rest assured they won't be for long, as within 2 weeks' time, the mining sector paralysis I forecast in my 2015 predictions audio blog will likely be mainstream news. To that end, recall what I wrote above of the massive overinvestment in essentially every manufacturing and mining sector on the planet, caused by the decades of malinvestment that history's greatest fiat Ponzi scheme fostered. Not to mention destructive Wall Street financial engineering. That said, the polar opposite is the case for precious metals, for reasons I have spent years discussing, which in the next 2 weeks will come to a head. As noted above, I worked for literally dozens of junior miners from 2006 to 2011, advising managements on how to allocate advertising budgets, traveling with them to and hosting investor meetings, visiting and writing of mining projects around the world, and attending mining conferences in the US, Canada, Mexico, Europe, and South Africa. Unfortunately, despite both metals achieving record prices in 2011, it was crystal clear to me then that the industry was heading toward imminent bankruptcy, having been literally starved of capital by a decade of gold and silver price suppression, mining share naked shorting, and history's most virulent propaganda campaign. I subsequently predicted the vast majority of the industry would collapse, particularly the junior miners that have traditionally generated the discoveries that fuel future production. Well, I couldn't have been more correct, as junior mining is but a shell of its past self, with essentially no money, no discoveries, and equally important, no hope. As for the major miners, production clearly has already peaked, and oil price decline notwithstanding, the cost of mining has dramatically increased for decades, not just due to higher input costs, but higher taxes, political and environmental risks, and the end of the low-hanging fruit in nearly all mining provinces. To wit, there have been essentially no major discoveries for 2 decades, and with mining equity plunging, already slashed spending budgets are on the verge of complete implosion. Now, starting next week, and particularly the following week, the world's largest gold and silver miners will report year-end earnings, as well as updated reserves and 2015 production and spending plans. Last year, PM capital spending was cut, on average, by 50%, and I believe this year's cuts may be similarly dramatic. As will downward reserve revisions, as gold and silver were smashed in the cartel's typical year-end paper raids to $1,183 per ounce and $1,578 per ounce respectively, at which mining companies are required to calculate the viability of their supposed reserves and resources. I believe even die-hard mining bears will be shocked at how ugly it gets, and subsequently how rapidly miners will merge with each other to cut costs further, and thus survive at today's criminally low prices. Nearly without question, it will start with the world's two largest gold miners, Barrick and Newmont, which have had significant merger discussions for years. And when this trend gets started, I expect it to snowball in the same manner as the 1999-2000 consolidation of the world's largest oil companies, which I watch front and center as a Wall Street oil analyst. Hence my prediction that 2015 will be the year of gold and silver mining paralysis. Consequently, the first signs of significant production decline should be painfully evident, and frankly, as predicted in October's Miles Franklin All-Star Silver Webinar panel, available online for free, the silver production outlook will likely be far worse than gold, particularly now that base metal prices are in sharp decline as well, as 2/3 of all silver production emanates as byproduct from base metal mines. In other words, the perfect storm of exploding physical demand and plunging physical supply is about to hit the powers that be like a runaway train on an icy track down a steep hill in a blinding blizzard. Well, that's enough for now as we await this week's potentially cataclysmic Greek tragedy to run its course, as well as who knows how many other horrifying political, economic, and social events. Consequently, we cannot emphasize just how dire the need has become to protect yourself from what's coming. And if you decide to act on such fears, we hope you'll call Miles Franklin at 800-822-8080 and give us a chance to earn your business. And as always, I can be reached via email at ahoffman@milesfranklin.com.